There is a kind of inheritance that never appears on paper. No birth certificate records it. No family Bible mentions it. It does not sit in a church registry in Bavaria or a parish ledger in the Rhineland. It sits somewhere far older and far stranger, inside the molecules carried quietly and without permission from parent to child for over 1,000 years. Some German surnames are common enough to blend into the background of history. Smith, Fischer. But a small number of names are different. They are rare, geographically strange, and oddly persistent. They surface in isolated valleys, in single villages, in scattered pockets across Central Europe, as if something kept them alive when the empire that produced them did not survive. For a long time, genealogists treated these names the way they treated most surnames, as administrative accidents. A location, a father's first name, frozen into a family forever. Stable but ultimately shallow. Then genetic genealogists started testing the men who carried them, and the results did not behave the way surnames are supposed to behave. This is the story of 13 rare German surnames, the Holy Roman Empire that shaped them, and the DNA evidence suggesting that some family names may be carrying something closer to a fossil record than a family tree. For most of modern history, the story of a German surname was considered settled. Surnames in the German-speaking world solidified gradually between the 12th and 16th centuries, largely for practical reasons. As towns grew and taxation, land ownership, and guild membership required more precise identification, a single given name was no longer enough. So people were named for what they did: Bauer, the farmer; Weber, the weaver; or for where they lived, or less often, for who their father was. Historians believed this process was mostly local and mostly recent, relative to the deep past. A surname, in this view, was a medieval bureaucratic convenience. It told you almost nothing about biological ancestry. Two unrelated men in two different regions could both become Schäfer, simply because they both herded sheep. The name was cultural, not genetic. That was the accepted framework, and it held for generations of genealogical research. It made sense. It was tidy, and it left surprisingly little room for what came next. The first sign that something did not fit came from an unlikely source. Population geneticists studying Y chromosome DNA, the genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, much like a surname itself. Researchers began to notice something curious in certain rare, regionally isolated German surnames. Men who shared these uncommon names, even when their documented family trees diverged centuries ago, even when they lived hundreds of kilometers apart, were showing Y chromosome signatures that were unusually similar. Not identical, not proof of a single ancestor beyond doubt, but similar enough that the odds of pure coincidence became difficult to ignore. If surnames were purely cultural labels, adopted independently by unrelated families, this pattern should not exist. The paternal line should be as scattered and unrelated as the general population. Instead, some rare names appear to be acting like genetic anchors, as if the name and the Y chromosome had, in certain lineages, been traveling together far longer than expected. That was the crack in the old story. This is where the science had to enter carefully, because Y chromosome DNA is a very specific kind of witness. It does not tell the whole story of ancestry. It tells only the story of the direct paternal line, father to father to father, stretching backward in time. Autosomal DNA, the kind most people think of with a modern ancestry test, mixes together every ancestral line into a blended average. The Y chromosome does something different. It preserves a single unbroken thread. Researchers comparing surname data to Y chromosome haplogroups, broad genetic families defined by shared mutations, found that certain rare German surnames clustered overwhelmingly within specific haplogroups. Not a majority, not a certainty for every individual carrying the name, but a signal, repeating across unrelated families, strong enough to suggest that some of these surnames may preserve the genetic echo of a single medieval founder, or a very small founding population whose male descendants scattered, multiplied, and kept the name intact even as the empire around them was breaking apart. If you are drawn to stories where the evidence quietly rewrites what we thought we knew, this is a good moment to subscribe. Because the deeper this investigation goes, the stranger the inheritance becomes. The conflict did not resolve there. It widened, because when researchers began cross-referencing these surname clusters against the political map of the Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling, fractured, thousand-year patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and principalities that dominated Central Europe from the 10th century until its dissolution in 1806, something unexpected began to emerge. Some of the rarest, most genetically consistent surnames were not evenly distributed across German-speaking lands. They were concentrated near old imperial administrative centers, mining regions, monastic estates, and border territories, the exact zones where the empire's fragmented governance meant that isolated communities could persist for centuries with limited outside marriage, limited migration, and unusually strong record-keeping through church parishes and guild rolls. In other words, the empire's very disorganization, its famous patchwork of semi-independent territories, may have accidentally created genetic time capsules. Isolated founder populations, protected not by geography alone, but by centuries of political fragmentation. Researchers remain cautious here. Is not proof that every rare German surname traces to a single medieval man. Genetic drift, small sample sizes, and incomplete historical records all complicate the picture. But the pattern is consistent enough that several population genetic studies of European surname lineages, most notably research building on Y chromosome surname projects across the UK, Ireland, and parts of continental Europe, have treated rare, regionally confined surnames as a genuinely useful proxy for tracing deep paternal ancestry, precisely because rarity reduces the chance of independent, unrelated adoption of the same name. At this point, 3 explanations were on the table, and no single one could yet claim victory. The first, a strict founder effect. A single medieval man, or a tight cluster of brothers or cousins, adopted a rare occupational or locational name, and their descendants, through centuries of relatively closed, rural marriage patterns typical of the empire's small territories, simply outcompete the alternative explanations. The Y chromosome stayed consistent because the founding population was small and the surrounding community rarely absorbed outsiders into the male line. The second, convergent adoption within a tightly related regional population. Even without a single founder, if a small, genetically similar community, say, the population of one imperial mining town or one monastery's tenant farmers, independently generated a rare name from a shared local dialect word, the resulting Y chromosome similarity could still be strong, simply because the community itself was already genetically narrow before the surname existed. The third, and the most unsettling for genealogists, non-paternity events layered on top of a genuine founder lineage. Historical records suggest that formal adoption, guardianship, and unrecorded paternity were far more common in the medieval and early modern periods than most family trees admit. If a surname line experienced a genetic break at some point, but the name and social identity continued unchanged, the DNA and the documented family tree would tell 2 different stories, and only one of them would be visible on paper. None of these explanations cancel each other out. In different family lines, carrying the same surname, more than one may be true simultaneously. That is, in itself, part of what makes this evidence so difficult and so compelling. The most significant turning point came not from a single genealogy company's marketing claims, but from broader academic surname DNA research, studies that combined large-scale Y chromosome databases with historical demographic modeling. These projects moved beyond simply matching 2 men who shared a name. They modeled the statistical likelihood that shared haplotypes among rare surname carriers could have arisen by chance, compared against the likelihood of a shared paternal origin within the last 500 to 1,000 years, a window that lines up almost exactly with the rise and consolidation of hereditary surnames across German-speaking Central Europe. The results, across multiple rare surname clusters, consistently favored shared origin over coincidence. Not for every name, not for every man, but for a meaningful, repeatable subset, enough that researchers began describing certain rare surnames as functioning like genetic isotopes, decaying and dispersing outward from a single point in time and space, still detectable centuries later if you know how to look. And this is where the twist arrives. Because the assumption going in was simple: if a rare German surname traced to a single founder, that founder was, obviously, German, a local man, from a local village, embedded entirely within the cultural and biological landscape of Central Europe. But haplogroup data does not always cooperate with that assumption. In several documented surname studies across Central Europe, researchers found that some rare paternal lineages, the deep, ancient branches beneath the medieval founder, traced back to haplogroups more strongly associated with migrations from Eastern Europe, the Eurasian steppe, or even, in specific instances, populations with roots stretching toward the Near East, arriving in Central Europe over 1,000 years before the surname itself existed. This does not mean the founder was a recent foreign immigrant when the surname formed. It means something quieter, and in some ways more remarkable. The deep paternal ancestry of these rare German lineages did not originate in the German lands at all. It arrived generations, sometimes centuries, before the empire existed in any recognizable form, carried by earlier migrations, absorbed into the local population, and only much later crystallized into a name that looks, on the surface, entirely and unmistakably German. Not a hidden foreign ancestor discovered by surprise. Something older than that. A signal showing that German ancestry at the level of the Y chromosome was never a closed system. It was a long accumulation, Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, and in places, further-flung populations, layered together over thousands of years, with the Holy Roman Empire acting less like an origin point and more like a container that gathered an already mixed population and gave it, for the first time, standardized names. The genome was not contradicting the story of these 13 surnames. It was revealing an older, deeper story beneath the one written in parish registers. This matters beyond genealogy hobbyists chasing a name back through the centuries. It reframes something bigger. The idea of a pure regional or ethnic lineage, stable and unchanging across 1,000 years, does not hold up well against the genome's own record. Populations that look homogeneous on the surface, sharing language, surname patterns, folklore, and religious tradition, often carry, quietly, the genetic residue of movements and mixtures that predate any of those cultural markers by centuries or millennia. The Holy Roman Empire itself makes this almost inevitable. It was never a single nation in the modern sense. It was a shifting confederation of hundreds of semi-autonomous territories, absorbing traders, soldiers, refugees, and settlers from Slavic lands to the east, Italian territories to the south, and Frankish and Celtic populations to the west, for the better part of a millennium. A surname that emerges from this environment is not a snapshot of ethnic purity. It is a snapshot of where a family happened to be standing when record-keeping caught up with them. Picture a river valley in what is now Thuringia or the Upper Palatinate, sometime in the 14th century. Smoke rising from a scattering of timber houses. A miller's son, a tanner's apprentice, a family recorded for the first time by a monastery scribe under a name drawn from the trade they practiced or the hillside they farmed. None of them know, and none of them could know, that the blood moving quietly through their bodies had already crossed mountain ranges, followed river systems, and mingled with strangers for longer than their language had existed. The name is new. The lineage beneath it is not. That is the quiet power of Y chromosome evidence. It does not care about borders drawn on medieval maps, or which prince controlled which valley, or which century a family name was finally written down. It simply persists, father to son, an unbroken thread running underneath the recorded history of an empire that no longer exists. If this kind of layered, evidence-driven history is the kind of thing you want more of, let me know in the comments which surname or region I should investigate next. There are entire buried migrations waiting inside names we've always assumed were simple. So where does that leave the 13 rare surnames this story began with? Not diminished. If anything, they carry more weight than before, not less. A rare German surname, tested carefully against modern population genetics, does not simply hand you a single tidy ancestor and a satisfying ending. It hands you a chain of unresolved questions. A founder whose origins may reach further than his own century, a lineage that may have crossed cultural boundaries the historical record never thought to mention, a name that survived empires, wars, plagues, and migrations by doing nothing more dramatic than being passed, quietly from father to son. The old story treated a German surname as a medieval invention, practical, local, shallow. The DNA evidence suggests something closer to a palimpsest, a name written in the 14th century, over ancestry that may stretch back thousands of years earlier, through populations the empire itself never fully understood it contained. The map of who came from where, who mixed with whom, and when, is still being redrawn. Every rare surname tested adds another data point, another thread, another small correction to a story that was always more complicated than the parish registers let on. Somewhere, right now, a man carrying one of these 13 names is going about an ordinary day, entirely unaware that his Y chromosome may be one of the last living witnesses to a migration that happened before the Holy Roman Empire, before the concept of Germany, before most of what we think of as European history had even begun. The name looks simple. It is not. It never was.